Welcome back to another episode of the Health Mastery Show. I am your host, Adam MacDonald, and today I have on a really interesting guest, Dr. Eric Trexler. Eric is a researcher out of UNC Chapel Hill, and for any basketball fans, you'll know that's the home of Michael Jordan. He's a coach at Stronger by Science, a contributor for MASS, which is monthly applications in strength sports, and he's a pro natural bodybuilder. In this episode, we talk about metabolic adaptations in both weight loss and weight gain, how perceived results on paper may not match real world results due to these adaptations, and also we cover the topic of how lean can someone realistically stay there without any negative health effects or lifestyle consequences. It was a really insightful conversation for myself, and I feel this information is very, very useful for anyone who wants to understand what happens to your metabolism when we try to alter our body weight, whether that's up or down, gaining weight or losing weight. The timestamps are in the show description, and if you find this episode any way useful, please do leave a rating or review on iTunes or Apple Podcasts. It really helps with the ranking of the podcast. You can reach out to me directly with any future topics or questions you have regarding this episode or any future episodes. My email is also in the show description, or you can get me on my Instagram, which is AdamMac192. Alright, Eric, so thanks so much, my man, for coming on today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So Eric, you're not only a doctor or a PhD, but you're also a natural bodybuilder, and that's one of the kind of things that I really like about talking like people like yourself. You're also in the trenches, because sometimes you can get bodybuilders on one side who talk about evidence and research, and then on the other side you got researchers, but it's not that often that you come across the two people who actually are competitive, and you're a pro natural bodybuilder, but also are in depth and in the weeds in the research as well. So first question that I actually like to ask, specifically when I meet like tenured natural bodybuilders, so they could be pro or not pro, just people who've been doing natural bodybuilding a long time, is why natural bodybuilding? Why do you do natural bodybuilding? Because it's kind of strange, I guess, from the outside. You stepping on stage all tanned up, and then specifically why natural bodybuilding and not, open bodybuilding or non-drug tested bodybuilding? What's your calling, or what's your reason why you do this?
That's a good question. So as you mentioned, there's like a small group of people now that are doing bodybuilding and research on bodybuilding. And it's cool that we need to have like an annual meeting. In the last few months, I've worked on some projects with a handful of them. So really good folks out there who are doing similar stuff. Peter Fitchin, Brandon Roberts, Eric Helms, Andrew Chappell over in the UK. There's this group of people that's doing really cool work. And so the question is, why are you doing the bodybuilding along with the research? And honestly, I do bodybuilding because I think the human body is fascinating. I think the physiology related to bodybuilding is remarkably interesting. And so I think one of the things that separates me from a lot of other bodybuilders, it's actually kind of funny. I did a different podcast, and there was like a Facebook thread, and people actually said some kind of nasty things about me, but I have a really self-deprecating sense of humor, so I kind of was like, dude, I agree. Like, I think I'm the worst. But they kind of assumed that I was really narcissistic because they saw a bodybuilding picture of me, and it was like a general population Facebook group. And I think a lot of people think if you do bodybuilding, it's because you're self-absorbed and you think your body is fantastic and you can't wait to show it to people. And if that's why you do it, I mean, that's fine with me. I'm not worried about it. But the reason I do bodybuilding is because I think it's really cool what happens when you try to make muscles grow, what happens when you try to lose more body fat than your body would like to lose. I think some of the physiological responses and consequences of those processes are immensely fascinating. And so that's why I like to do it, and that's why I like to study it. For me, there's really no separation between whether I'm competing, coaching, or researching the topic. These are just different ways of expressing the same interest in the general concept. So that's why I do bodybuilding. And counterintuitively, I actually think I look terrible when I compete because it's like natural bodybuilding, the look that gets rewarded right now. competitively is not like the beach body. It's the like almost dead, detailed hamstring, striated glutes look. And so when I get into that kind of shape, I look awful. Like nobody's like, oh wow, Eric, you're looking really handsome right now. So yeah, I do bodybuilding because I find it fascinating from a physiology perspective. Now, why natural bodybuilding? That's a really good question, and I'll be completely honest with my answer here. I think most people that get into bodybuilding at some point consider, what if I did non-natural bodybuilding? What would that look like? What would the ramifications be? Because if you get into bodybuilding, theoretically, you're interested in being very muscular. And the drug route is certainly a very expeditious way to become very muscular. And so when I was in probably my late teens, I thought about what would that look like and what would that entail. And the reason I stayed natural was because when I thought about what it would look like to go the other route, in America, there's legal risk. No matter where you are, there's health risk involved. And so for me, I just didn't want to deal with the legal risks and the health risks associated with the use of anabolics. And I knew I wanted to compete. So if you're going to be competitive and go the non-natural route, like a person my height, I would have to gain like 70 pounds. So it's not like you can just kind of tiptoe into that world and be competitive. Once you go that route, it has to be like your life at that point. And especially when I was actually considering, like actually thinking about that concept, back then, I don't know if men's physique even existed, if I'm being honest. I can't remember when that became a thing exactly, but in any case, it certainly wasn't as prominent as it was today. So it was the decision was literally, if you want to still compete in this stuff, you have to gain 70 pounds, you have to assume health risks, and you have to assume legal risks. And when I put all those together, I was like, I think I'm just going to stay natural. It just didn't make sense to me. But I will say, like, I know there are people out there that go the other route that aren't natural. And as long as you're not competing against naturals, and as long as you're informed of the health risks associated, I'm not one to really demonize people for doing that.
Yeah, I think you touched on a good point there with if you're competitive and you actually, consider doing it, then you are going to have to put on a serious amount of mass. It's not like you're just going to do it for a little bit and then you're all of a sudden going to get huge. You genuinely have to, commit to the cause. And, that's probably one of the reasons why I chose not to do this, because I have this, I wouldn't say addictive personality, but if I want to do something, I really want to push and be the best. And it starts to have those, negative effects, and more so in your health. The bigger and the larger you get, and there's just a lot of complications with that. So, that's pretty interesting, considering you're interested in the whole kind of how the body works and the physiology part of it, and how what happens to the body with building muscle and etc. Because obviously that's exacerbated with with the use of steroids or anabolics.
Yeah, I mean, I was during my PhD, I took a physiology class with a nutrition professor. It was like nutritional biochemistry. And this nutrition professor, when we started the class, didn't know anything about bodybuilding, certainly didn't have an interest in it. But it was like every time we talked about a particular aspect of nutritional biochemistry or physiology, I would come up to her after class and have some kind of anecdote of like an absolutely disastrous instance of a bodybuilder trying to exploit that and either failing or something absolutely terrible happening. And not to make light of it, but this stuff is fascinating. Like, here's how the physiology works. Here's how people tried to exploit it, and here is the result or the ramifications of that. And so by the end of the semester, she was like a very intimidating professor. Most people were like very scared of her. She and I were like best buddies, and I think I developed, like, I helped her develop a morbid curiosity in the kind of enhanced bodybuilding world and all the different channels of physiology that they've tried to exploit, either unsuccessfully or disastrously. And then obviously in some cases it actually works pretty well. But no, so I mean, from someone who's interested in the physiology, when I first started following bodybuilding as a fan, it wasn't natural bodybuilding. I was following the other guys because I was like, oh my God, look at what's happening to these bodies. So no, I mean, like, the enhanced side of things is still intellectually fascinating. And I enjoy reading about it, but you can't study it ethically, it's extremely difficult to study. And personally, like I said, just the legal risk, the health risk, it's just not for me. But I, absolutely, it's still fascinating for sure.
Yeah, I completely, can agree with you on that one, and I almost come from the exact same background. When I first got into it, I didn't know there was a natural thing as natural bodybuilding. I think I was maybe 16, and like most people, you don't realize that the drugs are involved until you're maybe a year or two in. But even now, I'm still a pretty big fan of bodybuilding, but it's not necessarily natural bodybuilding. Like, I do follow that, but I'm looking at the videos of the Mr. Olympia coming up and the Arnold Classic, and that's what I'm really interested in, because everybody wants to see the freaks and the guys who have the just insane genetics. I remember when I was like 18, I went to my first bodybuilding show, and there was just amateur competitors here in Ireland, so they weren't even like that high level, I should say. And I was just amazed at how big a human being could be, like, just because I'd only seen like average people, like in the gym, people who were maybe a little bit muscular. But then at that one show, it was just like, it was towards the end, or I think it was just the end of Ronnie Coleman's competitive career, maybe 1 year afterwards, and he was doing a guest posing. So I got to meet him in the flesh, like, for my first time meeting a pro bodybuilder. And I was like,
God.
Yeah, when I was 18, I was like, holy crap, his veins are like the same size as my fingers. That is insane. I was like, it just, the amount of attention and, I don't know, commandment that these people draw towards them when they walk into a room. Obviously, like, kind of a room of fanboys, I guess, kind of like a celebrity, but I just had this feeling about, wow, that's a really kind of dominant, awe-inspiring figure, and that's kind of why I fell in love with it to an extent. And then, like you mentioned, all the different reasons why you chose not to, do the non-natural route, and a kind of the cost-benefit reward. And like you said, people do think about it. When people think like, oh, just because I'm natural, I'm really against steroids. I mean, I'm not. It's just a choice that I choose not to make, and everybody thinks about it. Like, even if you choose, like, you're really against it, you still have thought about it. You just thought not to do it.
Yeah, for some people, the thought process takes longer and is more difficult, but everybody thinks about it. You either reject it immediately, or you reject it after a couple days of thinking about it, or, there's a wide spectrum of how you react to that thought, but I think the thought enters everybody's mind at some point.
Yeah. So to get onto the area specifically of this podcast, and I know you've recently become a coach full-time with Stronger by Science. You're an online physique coach, a strength coach. But before that, you'd spent a number of years researching, should I say, after you'd done your PhD. And one of the areas that you focused on, which is pretty cool, and one of the reasons why I invited you on here today, was that you're looking at research in bodybuilding, or the bodybuilding community, which isn't really something that's common. Like, you mentioned that it is coming on a bit more, and we do have that group of like Eric Helms and Peter Fishin and a few other guys as well, I guess, because the money's not really there, and who's going to fund this. But some of the areas that you looked at were metabolic adaptation, so the metabolism and how that's affected by dieting and training, and mainly in a calorie deficit, or specifically around contest prep. But do you want to give a kind of quick overview of your research behind there, and the kind of what you found that was maybe new or groundbreaking?
Yeah, so during my PhD, there was kind of a series of studies that I was involved with, looking at this general concept. And right before I started my master's degree, my graduate work, I did a contest prep, and it was the first time I had gotten like really lean. My very first ever prep, I got lean enough to like win the novice division, but not really, really lean. So I entered grad school like a week after my first legitimate, like super lean contest prep. And I was like, what the hell just happened? Like, that was crazy. And so I became interested in trying to figure out, it's not like I was the only person. I mean, there was a lot of people who were kind of drawing attention to what's actually happening when people are getting in this kind of shape and what happens after that. Because the transition from diet to post-competition is quite a jarring transition. And so the first project was a review paper. And actually, Lane Norton was a co-author on that. He was super helpful in the process. And so the review paper came out in 2014, and we were just looking at the evidence out there of what could be explaining the different physiological changes that competitors go throughout contest prep. And then over the next couple years, we ran a couple of case studies looking at individual bodybuilders, tracking a number of parameters throughout their contest preparation, and usually for at least a month or two after preparation to try to look at that post-competition window. And we also did a small study with Bill Campbell down at the University of South Florida. Bill is awesome. Can't say enough good things about Bill. But we did a little study looking at a small group of competitors, specifically in that like 4 to 6 week window after their final competition of the season. And to it's kind of a whole line of research that it was not my dissertation work, but it was like my passion project that I kept on the side, was just doing these different case studies and small studies. And generally what we found, to kind of put it all in a brief summary, is when you lose weight for a competition, anytime you lose weight, you would expect that your total energy expenditure is going to go down. You spend energy to keep your tissues alive and functioning, and when you have less tissues because you lost weight, your energy expenditure is going to drop. But what we find in physique athletes and bodybuilders is it drops more than you would anticipate. And so that's something that should be accounted for, and it's something that should be planned for when you're kind of going into a contest prep. In the post-competition window, we generally find that a lot of these changes in energy expenditure and unfavorable changes in a variety of hormones, they do seem to be reversed, which is a good thing. But what we also see is in that immediate post-competition period, the weight that gets gained immediately after competitions tends to almost exclusively be fat tissue. And so one of the things I'm interested in figuring out moving forward, because I am still working on some projects in this area, moving forward, I would like to try to figure out, in that post-competition period, how can we maximize recovery of energy expenditure, of hormone levels, while hopefully minimizing the proportion of weight that is regained as fat. I think right now it would appear that the people who regain a lot of fat very quickly seem to generally recover very quickly. But the best of both worlds would be if we could control that weight regain process and manage it better, so that there's a higher proportion of lean mass regain, but still plenty of recovery when it comes to energy expenditure and hormone levels. So, right now, I think we've done a good job in the research of documenting what happens during prep. I think moving forward, we need to try to start figuring out strategies to attenuate those unfavorable changes throughout prep, and hopefully figure out how to manage that post-competition period in a way that's going to be optimal for long-term success in the sport and for long-term health.
So basically what you're saying in summary is that you want to see how lean people could stay whilst not feeling like crap anymore. So it's starting feeling normal, but not just getting fat. And that would be the ideal scenario for most people. But in reality, that's not really the case for most people. I think there's probably a lot that comes into it, people when they gain weight post-contest or post-diet even, and maybe not per se that they're gaining so fast so they can recover, but just some of the psychological effects of the diet itself, that even if on paper you did figure it out, it would probably be hard for a lot of people to maintain this kind of maybe slowly incremental weight in gaining weight.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I mean, I think I don't want to overgeneralize, but I think most people that have done a contest prep and tried to do a very controlled refeeding period after, so you could call it a reverse diet or a recovery diet if you'd like, but the more controlled and strict you try to be with that reverse diet process, I think a lot of people notice that is actually psychologically a lot more difficult than the prep was. At least I've noticed that myself. I can prep all day and it's fine, but trying to do a very slow and strict and controlled reverse diet seems to be a remarkably challenging thing to do. And I also don't think it's necessarily advisable when people take it to an extreme. So, there's a lot of debate like recovery diet versus reverse diet. And the general premise of the debate is, how lean should you try to stay and for how long? And I think Eric Helms does a really nice job of trying to emphasize how critical it is to actually prioritize recovery and not try to stay in contest shape for months on end. Unless you have an extended season and you've planned ahead for that. The idea that when you're done competing for the season, that you're just going to add, minimal amounts of calories over like a 9-month period. Like, I don't think, based on what we know currently, I don't think that's a particularly advisable strategy.
Yeah, and I think I completely agree with you in terms of you finding it difficult. And it's pretty funny the way that you've kind of got into this. I'm in the exact same situation that you are now, or you were when you were doing your grad studies or your master's. I'm in the depths of a contest prep in between shows. I've got a show next week, but I also have potentially a show in November. That'll be the Worlds if I choose to compete at that or not. But also I'm starting a master's in like 9 days after my show next week. And that will be my first master's. And but the thing is, I've kind of know what to expect when I post show because I've competed twice before, and and this is, like you said, like you explained for yourself, this is the leanest that I've ever been. The last time I competed, I was 10 pounds heavier, and that was 3 years ago. So it's going to be interesting, and it's going to be interesting to see if I'm actually able to do the further show in November after like 2 months of college, and also just the general feeling of post-contest or just extended dieting period. But I think one thing that a lot of people, they want to do, or their goal is, I guess, even if they're not say necessarily going to compete, is they're like, okay, I'm going to get to this really lean level of body fat and whatever that might be in their head, but usually it's like abs or something like that, and then they'll say, then I'm going to maintain that. And maybe one thing that they don't realize is that yes, they can get there even if it's difficult, because you have the goal that you're working towards, and the suffering and the sacrifices are they're there, but it's easier to stick to it and persevere when you have that light at the end of the tunnel. But then when you're trying to do like a maintenance or maintain levels of leanness, even though people really like to do it, psychologically it just becomes so much more difficult. But from a physiological aspect and just general health in just metabolic health and just hormones, etc., how lean do you think somebody can actually stay? And is there a possibility, I know we didn't talk too much about adaptations and metabolism just yet, but is there a possibility that people can get their metabolism back up to normal while still maintaining some level of leanness that they weren't at previous? Or does your metabolism closely tie in with, say, your body fat levels and your body fat set point range, so that kind of range of body fat that your body just likes to naturally hang around?
So that's a good question, and I don't know if I can answer it without speculating. So I'm going to go a little bit out on a limb and speculate some. So I do believe that you can get your energy expenditure to a higher level while maintaining leanness. I've definitely seen anecdotes of people I trust that have done that. They've gotten down to a particular level of body fat, very slowly reverse dieted, and they seem to be maintaining that leanness on much higher calories. And I feel like I've seen too many anecdotes of that from people I trust to dismiss them. What I would expect is happening, and I could be wrong on this, what I would expect is happening is that, non-exercise energy expenditure is this kind of catch-all term that describes the energy that you expend beyond resting levels that is not attributable to exercise or the thermic effect of food. I guess in this case we could tie the thermic effect of food in. But what I would speculate is happening is as they're slowly increasing their caloric intake, their body, and more specifically their hypothalamus, is probably nudging their total energy expenditure upward. And the specific manifestation of that would be an increase in non-exercise expenditure, along with a small increase in the thermic effect of food, because now you're eating slightly more food. And so the idea is that as you're slowly bumping calories up, you're also slowly adjusting your energy expenditure upward in a completely subconscious manner. And so what I think is happening is those two aspects of the calories in, calories out equation, I think that they are moving in tandem upward, so that the overall energy balance is largely unaffected, because as the caloric intake goes up, the energy expenditure also goes up in a proportional manner. And what you'll see with these people who have pulled it off, and they're like, yeah, it's been 6 months since my show, I'm still as lean, I'm eating, a few hundred more calories per day and maintaining. What you find is, in most cases, they still haven't recovered. Their hormones are still low. They still feel like crap. A lot of the kind of side effects that we associate with the endocrine changes that come with contest preparation, the restoration of those hormones and the mitigation of those side effects seems to be quite delayed. And so I don't think they're actually cheating the system. I think, people will see that on Instagram and say, oh my God, they've been maintaining contest shape for this long and now they're eating more. And they think it's awesome, but you'll see this with, some bodybuilders are able to get in shape eating 1,400 calories. Others can get in shape eating 1,800 calories. But if they're both getting equally lean, they're going to feel approximately equally terrible when they're in shape. And I'm exaggerating. It's not that bad, but it's not pleasant to be in contest shape. So yeah, I think that's kind of a long-winded answer, but I think that can occur, but I don't think it's quite as cool as people think. I don't think it's like, a weird hack where you're like cheating the system. And another part of your question was, how lean can people get? I think it was like, how lean can people get and kind of hope to maintain it? Is that?
Yeah. So I mean, you touched on the point where yeah, you can walk your calories back up, but essentially you're still going to feel like crap. So the only difference is you're going to be eating some extra rice, but you're still going to be feeling pretty crappy, and you might even still be hungry because your body fat's so low.
You will be.
And I guess that's just the opposite effect of what's happening when you diet, is that the NEAT goes down. So you should say, well, I should be losing weight, but because your NEAT is going down, which makes up a grand majority of your actual metabolism or the energy output or the energy balance equation, that, when you say we should be losing weight, but I'm not losing weight because I'm eating X amount of calories, it's just the opposite effect, but on the way up. So you'll just start to move more, you'll just burn more calories, but because of body fat levels and, leptin levels and your hormone levels, you're still going to be feeling like crap. So then I guess on top of that question would be then, okay, let's say regardless of food intake, and let's say we can walk food up so you're not just eating like a rabbit, how lean do you think somebody can maintain but not feel like death? Or not, I won't say death, I would say just not feel like low energy, low libido, like just feel normal again? Do you think that people really do have to come back up to that normal level of body fat and maintaining a six-pack or cover model kind of look where it's not shredded but fairly lean is probably not possible, unless you're having some assistance with some drugs, or else you're actually just you're sacrificing health or just general sense of well-being?
Yeah, so I think it certainly is going to vary from person to person. I think some people are able to maintain a lean physique better than others in terms of the hormonal ramifications of being that lean. But I think the encouraging thing is I think you can get pretty lean and maintain it. And when I say pretty lean, I'm talking, I think there's a lot of people out there that can pretty comfortably maintain at 9, 10, 11% body fat. And I think there's some people that are actually pretty okay, even down at like the 8-ish level, depending on their physiology, their eating environment. Like some people are that are just like really into fitness and they don't view it as a huge burden. I think there are some people that can maintain kind of at the higher end of single digit or lower end of double digit body fat. And I think for most people, that's a pretty visually appealing physique. Like if you're maintaining at that level, certainly your metabolic health will be in pretty good shape, generally speaking, in terms of like chronic disease risk. So it's a healthy body fat, assuming that you don't have huge drop-offs in all these hormones that we've talked about, which I think most people won't get to that level if they're at like 9% body fat. I remember back in the day, it was pretty manageable for me to maintain when I was like probably 17, 18 years old. It was pretty manageable for me to maintain kind of like probably 9 or 10% body fat. It wasn't too bad. I was expending a lot of energy because I was really active, and it was fine. Like I didn't have any endocrine consequences of trying to maintain there, but I do think it varies from person to person. I'd say another thing to keep in mind is that if you're starting in a state of relatively high adiposity, so if you have a great deal of excess body fat to lose, what you'll find is that as you go from being like in the more like obese body composition category, as you start approaching normal weight, and again, I'm just using these clinical terms, so please don't, if you're listening, don't think I'm using obesity as a pejorative, and normal has a lot of it's kind of an emotionally charged word, so I'm just using the kind of clinical terms. But as you start transitioning from that obese body composition category to more of a normal weight category, you actually see the inverse. Like you'll see a positive change in endocrine levels. You'll generally feel much better in a lot of cases. So I think everybody's got a sweet spot of body composition where they feel plenty of energy, their sex hormones are in good working order and everything's in balance and they're doing all right. And then I think when you perturb that in either direction, that's where you start to see some consequences. And I think most people, when you start getting down, some people, if they get to like 9% body fat, they're going to feel it. No doubt about that. But I think everybody, just about everybody, when they start getting to like 7, 6, 5% as a male, that's when you're like, all right, yeah, just about everybody down there is going to be feeling that stuff.
Yeah, we talked about. I talked about this with Dr. Carl Nadolski a couple of weeks back. He's an obesity doctor and works with people who are, obese. Not just obese people, but a lot of obese people who are trying to get their weight down. And he's mirrored the exact same thing. That when you're getting too fat or adding too much body fat, you actually start to see some negative hormone consequences. And then, of course, he's actually competed as well once, and this isn't really, most people probably won't ever get to the point where it starts to really negatively affect their hormones in terms of leanness, because it just gets so hard. But it starts to have the similar effects the leaner you get as well, in terms of your testosterone and leptin levels, etc.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought Carl up, because Mike Israetel shared an article I wrote about this topic, and Carl commented on it and said, this stuff is good, but don't forget that we also see issues at higher body fat ranges when it comes to these hormones. And I actually really appreciated that Carl mentioned that, and I was like, yeah, absolutely, like I totally agree. That's just not who I wrote the article for. The article was like, if you're going from normal weight to super lean, what to expect. But it's an important thing to note. So ever since he kind of said, hey, some people might misinterpret this, you should probably mention this. Ever since he said that, I've been a lot more conscious about pointing out that end of the spectrum as well. And one thing a little caveat, you mentioned like a lot of people won't get lean enough to really see this stuff happening. That's probably true, but a lot of the stuff can also happen to some extent from just short-term energy restriction if it's extreme enough. So a lot of people will get to the point where they feel like crap because over the last 3 weeks they've been doing some really extreme restriction. So, very few people are going to be getting down to 5 or 6% body fat, but a lot of people are going to be having acute reductions in sex hormone levels, leptin levels, and they're going to feel like absolute crap because they've done really extreme short-term restriction.
So would you say that somebody who, let's say, took a longer contest prep or just a longer extended dieting period and got very, very lean, they started to have these adaptations to the calorie deficit and just being so lean, a person B who just wasn't necessarily as lean but just did an extreme diet, let's say they just slashed calories by half or more, they would feel similar enough to the person who was extremely lean. Is that what you're saying?
I don't know if that's what I'm saying. So it's really difficult, because when we look at these long-term, like the people who do take the gradual approach, certainly some aspect of their adaptation pertains to the acute energy deficit, and some magnitude of that, of those effects is more related to the more chronic reduction of body fat. And so they're related responses. It's hard to untangle them in a person who's doing both. But I think what I would feel comfortable saying is the types of things that are affected by getting lean over time, so those changes in leptin, changes in testosterone and cortisol and the ratio between them, hunger, energy expenditure, subjective energy level, we see those same changes when a less lean person starts doing really extreme restriction. So, but I don't know if I can generalize to a spot where I say which is, is that short-term restriction feeling exactly as bad as getting to 5% body fat? I don't know if I can do that.
Say,
yeah.
Yeah, no, but I actually kind of, now that you mention it, when I do have like a refeed day or just eat extra calories, even though my body fat's not like significantly increasing, or probably not at all on that day, I do feel quite significantly better. So you did make a good point there to say that it's not just the body fat levels, but the acute calorie deficit. So most people that are extremely lean are also in a calorie deficit as well, simply just due to the fact that nobody really wants to maintain super lean levels of body fat.
Yeah, and so what you'll see, like you were mentioning, is when you're very, very lean, but you have a brief caloric surplus, it makes things, if you're at maintenance or certainly in a surplus, it makes things less bad in the short term. But as you see with people who do the extended reverse dieting thing, just going to maintenance and staying there and being really lean, it's not going to completely reverse. It's like being super lean in a surplus feels a lot better than being super lean in a deficit, but the surplus isn't going to get you back to like, oh yeah, I totally feel myself, and all that stuff is not a problem anymore.
Yeah, I completely gotcha. And that comes back to the point, I guess, then when we're talking about super lean levels of body fat being, having negative effects on your physiology, but also extreme levels of body fat. So I guess what the point is that it's probably not a good idea to go either, to stay within that range. So if let's say you're bulking, right, you're adding lean mass, it's probably a good idea at some point to say, okay, I've probably got enough body fat on me here where at a certain point I'm pushing towards, almost like levels of obesity. And it's not just like overnight, it's just like, okay, you're obese now, so you have all these adaptations, and I'm sure it comes on slowly. So there's probably a point where if you want to actually maximize your hormones for, let's say, body composition and muscle building, you probably don't want to get too lean, but you probably don't want to get too overweight or too fat either.
So it's tricky. In terms of general health, certainly you'd want to stay within that middle range. Like if your only goal was feeling good and living a long, happy, healthy life, you'd want to stay in the middle of that range. Now, I have heard some people use this concept and misapply it. And what they say is when we start to get really obese, the testosterone and estrogen ratio seems to drop. And so people have applied that and said, well, if you're obese, you need to get lean enough to correct that and then begin bulking. Like that's going to allow you to increase your lean mass. And if you're in that obese state with that less favorable testosterone to estrogen ratio, it's going to impair your ability to gain lean mass. While I understand why that's an appealing theory, it breaks down when you start observing the world around you. And what I mean by that is if I were to select, a group of the people with the most lean mass, the most muscle mass walking this planet, they're probably going to be natural, by the way, just to put that caveat.
Yeah. We don't like the non-natural bodybuilders on this show.
Well, it just, whenever you talk physiology, it just throws a wrench in everything.
Oh, of course. So, I'm just kidding. Yeah.
Yeah. So if I were to pick the people who have the most lean mass and the most muscle tissue, it's going to be probably sumo wrestlers and defensive linemen in American football. And what you're going to find with all of them is that their body fat level is high, pretty high. And so your observations of the world around you are still important, even if you don't have like a PubMed link for it. And so like if you're going to tell me that having high body fat is going to impair my ability to gain skeletal muscle, that just breaks down so hard when you look at the instances of like the highest documented fat-free mass indices of people who can realistically be presumed to be natural. They come from people with high body fat.
But could you say, I guess when I'm thinking of it just from a different lens, that these people who are linebackers or sumo wrestlers, when you think, like if you just think of one of those in your head, these guys have probably never done a cut in their life. They just consistently bulked for their whole life. They're just trying to pack on as much mass as possible. And that could also, and I'm just throwing that out there, that could also be a reason why they have so much mass, is because they've been in a calorie surplus for 10 years or something like that,
Yeah. No, I mean, certainly, yeah, these guys are on a 25-year permanent bulk. And that is why they have so much lean muscle. Or I'm sorry, lean muscle is a dumb term, but that's why they have so much lean mass and skeletal muscle tissue. But to me, like the idea that, sorry, you're obese, so now you're going to have an impaired muscle building response to training, I struggle to see how that effect would be large enough to care about when everyone I see in the sporting world who happens to be enormous also happens to have a very high level of body fat.
Gotcha. So even if it may exist, it's not big enough to necessarily worry about it per se. With the caveat though, if you are somebody who wants to be lean and wants to have like abs or wants to be close to 10% body fat, at some point you don't want to be getting above, the more adiposity or more body fat that you gain, the more chance of you actually losing muscle, because you're just going to have to diet for such a long period of time to get that additional body fat off. But that's a different,
absolutely,
that's a different kind of argument rather than saying, you're not doing it because of your hormones.
Yeah, and that's a good point. If your goal at the end of this process is to be muscular and very lean, you really should not be pushing your body fat too high, because you're just digging a hole for yourself that you're going to have to fix later. So my thing on this is the kind of theoretical argument that people are impairing their muscle gains by being obese, purely as a, looking at that in isolation as a standalone concept. I struggle to believe that effect is big enough to be particularly important. But more practically speaking, realistically, people are not like, what, I think I'm going to try to get up to about sumo wrestler size and then cut for a bodybuilding show. So it's one of those things that, like, theoretically, that's my argument, but practically speaking, it's not super useful, because most people have a couple goals. In terms of the people that I tend to talk with about nutrition and training.
Yeah, I'm not sure if there's too many sumo wrestlers who listen to this.
Probably not. But like, people that I talk to are usually interested in either having good general health or getting pretty damn lean eventually. And so for both of those cases, I would say, well, regardless of this kind of theoretical argument, you need to stay lean anyway. So it kind of becomes a little bit useless to worry about, because, like, if somebody's like, hey, I want to eventually be shredded and big, do I need to cut to fix my hormones so I can build muscle? I would say probably not, but you still probably ought to get closer to your eventual goal body weight anyway.
So probably, yeah, so probably not, but probably.
Yeah, it'd be like, well, I don't care if you cut now or later, but you're going to have to build some muscle and you're going to have to lose some body fat. But I don't think you're going to sabotage yourself if you focus on the muscle now and do the cut later. I don't think this small hormonal fluctuation of doing a cut now, then a bulk, then a cut, I don't think it's going to get you there any quicker.
Yeah, gotcha. So, Eric, I want to talk a little bit more about adaptations in metabolism, specifically when someone is dieting. So what happens as we start to diet? So what we kind of see is, let's say somebody's eating 3,000 calories, or whether they're tracking or not, but they're maintaining, and they plug in their calories needs into a calculator online, and they'll produce by 500 calories or whatever, and they expect to lose a pound or so a week, and maybe they do for a week or two, and then it just stops, and they're like, what's going on? I'm added in cardio, my weight's not dropping anymore, like, oh, my metabolism is slowing down. Can you explain to us a little bit what is going on there?
Yeah, so when we talk about energy expenditure, we're talking about your resting metabolic rate or your basal metabolic rate. There's a scientific distinction, but it's not worth caring about, practically speaking. There's your thermic effective feeding, which is just the calories you burn in the process of eating and metabolizing food. Your exercise activity thermogenesis, which is the calories you burn during exercise. And then there's your non-exercise activity thermogenesis, and that is all the other stuff you do. That's the energy you expend maintaining your posture, fidgeting in your chair, going to get the mail from the mailbox, washing your dishes after a meal while standing. It's all that extra stuff. And so what we see is, during a weight loss attempt, total energy expenditure, the sum of those things goes down. And some of that relates to the fact that as you lose body mass, you have less tissue to maintain energetically. And so that makes sense, and there's nothing you can do about that. But there's also an adaptive response. So the total drop in energy expenditure is larger than what you could attribute simply to the loss of mass. And what usually is the biggest factor getting affected there is the non-exercise activity component. And that's probably mostly mediated by leptin changes. And leptin is created by fat cells, and it's used as kind of a long-term energy sensor in the brain, just to keep an eye on how much fat we have and how much energy we can rely on if a famine happens to start off today. And leptin is also responsive to short-term energy availability. So if we drastically slash calories, especially calories from carbohydrate, we see a short-term leptin drop as well. And so leptin is responsive to the acute energy deficit and the long-term loss of fat. Leptin from the blood goes to the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus is what basically regulates most of the stuff we care about. Like, the hypothalamus has a huge impact on our eating behaviors, our feeding habits, our activity level. And so the hypothalamus is really the key structure of the brain that integrates all of our information about the energy inside and the energy outside. And so a lot of times in response to this leptin drop, the hypothalamus gets the message that there's not enough energy to go around, and it starts making some changes. And in that context, non-exercise activity drops, and there are also downstream effects on a variety of hormones. If you get into hormone physiology, you'll notice that hormones generally are, not always, but a lot of them are, they have a kind of a cascading loop that regulates their production. And for a lot of important hormones, the hypothalamus is kind of the first regulating structure that kind of helps regulate circulating levels of all these different hormones. So when you start messing with the hypothalamus, crazy things happen. And that's pretty much what's going on.
So at a certain point, do you think that fat loss can stop, or will this need come to zero, or will we just continue? Like, what can we do essentially to go against this, or to fight against this drop in need? And I actually really do resonate what you're saying right now. Everything just becomes more of a task, and even though like my calories may be quite low right now for what I was eating, not even that much heavier at a heavier body weight, things just become more of a drag. I even feel like I'm getting like neck pain simply because I don't think my posture is as upright as it was before. So I'm starting to get like a little bit of neck pain, and that's just, like you said, the drop in need, or that's at least what I'm attributing it to. But things like just cleaning the dishes, like picking up your coat when it's on the floor, and just everything just becomes a task and more difficult. It's like working out almost. I explained to some people that when you go shopping for presents around Christmas and you just walked for hours and hours, and you come home and like plop yourself on the sofa and you feel exhausted, you almost feel like that every day, but then you got to go train.
Yeah, you do. And it's tricky because, the first part of the question was, is the fat loss ever going to stop? And it kind of depends. I mean, like, as you probably do your diet in kind of a stepwise fashion where you make a diet change, eventually you reach a plateau, you make a new change. And so we hit plateaus all the time with weight loss. And what that means is, based on our energy expenditure and intake, we are no longer in a deficit. Some of that is because we've lost tissue and now we're a smaller person. Some of it might have to do with our training habits. The reduction in NEAT certainly can contribute to that. But the thing that I always remind people is that if you do happen to reach a plateau and these combination of factors put you at a spot where you're no longer losing weight and you're no longer able to achieve a deficit with your current nutritional intake, that's okay. We just alter things. We either remove food or we increase cardio. I almost always recommend removing food over increasing cardio, with some few exceptions, but I think people get a little cardio crazy on prep. But what I always remind people is this stuff with metabolic adaptation is important to be aware of for planning purposes, but it's not like, oh, I caught the metabolic adaptation, looks like my prep is over because fat loss is done. It's like, no, I mean, we can still keep nudging things in the right direction. We just might have to nudge things further than we wanted to. But everybody has a number at any given time that is going to help them achieve weight loss. Everybody that is alive still. And when you're really, really lean and depleted, that number still exists, but you might just happen to die if you starve. But like, no one is immune to starvation. So, you never hear about somebody who got stranded on like a desert island with no food and they came back fatter, so like.
Wait, there was a guy in that series Lost. He just remained fat the whole time.
I mean, it's possible that he has a remarkably thrifty metabolism. But no, I mean, everybody's got a number at which they will resume their fat loss. And if you're lean enough that number becomes dangerous, you need to stop losing weight. So a lot of times people view this as like, if I get metabolic adaptation, I'm screwed and my prep isn't going to work. And it's like, not really. You're just going to, like for me, when I prep, for me to get really lean, I often have to get my calories below 1,500. And so like what that looks like in practice is, I really wish I could have gotten this lean on 1,700 calories, but instead I had to do 15. And that was uncomfortable. That's the like worst case scenario here is, it turns out I had to cut a little more food than I wanted to. Yeah.
And that's really important that people hear that, because unless you've experienced it yourself and you're going through a fat loss phase, and maybe not even at the depths of like a contest prep, but at some point you're going to have these adaptations that your metabolism hasn't come to a halt. It just, these things happen within our physiology that are fighting against us, basically starving, and we just have to push a little bit harder, more so than what a calculator might say on the internet.
Yeah. And so one other thing that really derails people is, I know this sounds really cliche, but fluid retention can really mess with people. So like there have been times during preps in the past for myself, because I do my own diet and training and stuff, where I know that fat loss has to be occurring. And there's no way it's not occurring, because I know what I'm putting into my body. I know how I'm training, but the scale isn't moving. And so like if I didn't have a decent background in exercise, nutrition, physiology, then I can empathize. Like if I didn't study this stuff, I would have been like, oh crap, something's broken. Like this is not working and I'm in trouble. But in reality, what was happening was I was pushing the cardio too hard. I was training myself into the ground. I was retaining a ton of fluid, largely due to cortisol levels going through the roof. And so I just took like 3 or 4 days off and immediately shed that fluid. Like it was just gone in a matter of days. And so lo and behold, absolutely, the fat loss was still occurring, because it had to have been based on my intake. All that was happening was the fluid retention was masking that progress. And so I certainly understand why people will hear discussions about metabolic adaptation. They'll say, no, you don't understand. I was eating very little and my fat loss stalled. And a lot of times you have to say like, no, your fat loss continued, your weight loss stalled.
Yeah.
And if you more proactively manage that fluid retention, and that's not to like ascribe blame. Like sometimes you start retaining fluid, you got to figure out why, and you got to figure out what to do about it. But what they would find is actually their fat loss did in fact continue.
Yeah, I hate to parrot you consistently, but about a month ago when I did my first show of this contest season, I was holding my weight at like 176 or 177 for like week, 2 weeks, and I was doing a ton of cardio, like a lot of steps, and I was eating fairly low calories, like 1600 calories, 1700 calories, and my weight just wasn't dropping. And then I flew to America, California. The weather here in Ireland is pretty bad. It's raining, it's cold. Went to California, was like essentially had a week's vacation, went to the beach, it was sunny, and like dropped like 3 pounds like overnight essentially, and I maintained that then. And it was, like you said, just probably fluid retention, because I was actually losing fat that whole time. It was just that I was stressed, and I was stressed about not losing the water, which is then ends up being like a feedback loop from hell, where you're like, I'm stressed now, and some more cortisol, so I'm holding more water. And then
it gets even worse if like people with a little bit less self-restraint, not only are they psychologically stressed about the fluid retention, but they don't recognize that it's fluid retention, so they do more cardio to start getting the scale to nudge in the right direction, and they exacerbate the problem both psychologically and physiologically.
Yeah. Well, Eric, we're almost coming up on time, but I've got one final question for you, and this is a harder one to get answered, but maybe you can help. Is there a possibility that in the off season, or let's say muscle building phase, that we can, let's say we've dieted, we've done either extended dieting phase and you got fairly lean, whatever that means for that person, then you're like, okay, I'm going to have a really productive off season or building phase, and I'm going to maximize my metabolic capacity so that next time I diet, I don't have to diet on the same amount of calories because it suffered and it sucked and I was eating like very little. Is that something that you can actually do? Can we maximize our metabolism in the off season, so we're eating a ton of calories, so that now we can diet on 25%, 30% more calories to get to the same body weight as before? Or is it simply just all going to always come down to the same calories all the time?
I don't believe you can. I think I'm like kind of speculating, but I phrased that really confidently. But so the way I view it is your metabolic rate exists within a range, and you can suppress it or you can increase it beyond its normal level. But so what I'm getting at is there are studies showing that if we intentionally overfeed people, a lot of times they will increase their total energy expenditure in response to that overfeeding. And it's basically like the opposite of all the stuff we've talked about. So their body almost like defends their body weight during overfeeding by increasing energy expenditure. Now, some people have a more robust response than others. And so what we see, and there's been really good studies looking at a large group of people, and they will overfeed all of them, and they'll say some of these people just gained weight. Like you overfeed them, they gain weight. Other people, you overfeed them, and their energy expenditure goes through the roof to try to counteract that overfeeding, and they actually gain very minimal weight. And so when you see these stories of people who, they're like, oh my God, my prep was horrible and my food intake was like nothing, so I really took charge and I supercharged my metabolism, and look at me now. I think what's happening is we're seeing that during the end of their prep, they are talking about a food intake that is probably, it was low because they weighed less, and it was probably, 10% lower than it should have been due to metabolic adaptation, maybe just a little bit north of 10%. And then when they get into their bulked up stage, they gain some weight, so their energy expenditure is higher, but then they are also responding to the overfeeding. And that is a temporary, transient, adaptive increase in energy expenditure that could be like 10%. And so what we're looking at is just the inverse of metabolic adaptation, where because they are in an acute energy surplus, their metabolic rate is just trying to accommodate that surplus. And so I think what happens then is, so like, let's say I'm maintaining my off-season body comp at like 3,200 calories, but 200 of those are just an adaptive increase in metabolic rate because I'm overfeeding. If I drop from 3,200 to 3,000, I don't start losing weight. I just lose that adaptive bump that I was getting from being in a surplus.
Which essentially that's probably just, you'll just get a reduction in neat non-exercise activity.
Yeah, it'll just go down to where it should have been.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of times people that believe they have like rebuilt their metabolism from ground up and kind of cracked this physiological code, I think really what's happening is their metabolism was suppressed. So they fixed that, and that's an easy fix. You just start eating again and gaining some weight. But they basically reversed an unfavorable adaptation, caused a very transient increase in caloric expenditure from overfeeding. But what you see is that once you remove the overfeeding, you were maintaining at 3,200, you drop it to 3,000, and there's no weight loss. And so it's like your metabolism wasn't functionally changed. It was just responding to acute stimulation.
Yeah, kind of like
so you're going to end up
person,
so you're going to end up dieting on the same calories. If you manage the diet better, you might have less metabolic adaptation the second time through. So it doesn't mean you're going to have to diet on exactly the same calories the next time through. Like, there's a lot of factors that will go into exactly how that next prep goes. But you have not made a long-lasting, legitimate change to your body's metabolic rate.
Yeah, you haven't sped up your metabolism. That's it just doesn't work. You just can't speed your metabolism up. You can fix it if you're really, really lean, but you don't.
Yeah, and you can acutely stimulate it to be higher.
What way would you acutely stimulate it to be higher? So people would think, oh, if I can acutely stimulate it to be higher, that means I can acutely increase fat loss.
No, so it's the exact thing I'm talking about, which is just overeating.
Oh, gotcha. So I mean, if you're, that's kind of what we see when people have like done 10,000 calorie challenges and they don't gain like 2 pounds of body fat. Obviously, just like glycogen, but also they probably just get a ton of energy. Yeah.
I mean, when you talk about like, I would speculate that a lot of people who claim to be hard gainers, some of them just have really tight appetite regulation, but some of them I think just are on the higher end of the spectrum of when you overfeed them, their total energy expenditure seems to become elevated more than others, and they just have more of an adaptive response to accommodate that overfeeding. So yeah, you can acutely do that, especially if you're on the more favorable end of that spectrum. But the second you remove that surplus, you're back to normal.
Yeah, I think the way I kind of, and it's probably a bit of an oversimplification, but the way I try to explain to some people is, when you give kids those really sugary drinks and they just can't stop running around, they're just hyper energetic. It's kind of like that, where their NEAT has just gone through the roof because they've got so much carbs, so much more calories coming in.
Yeah, the NEAT gets higher. There's the whole kind of like activation of the sympathetic nervous system. But yeah, I mean, there are physiological responses to overfeeding that are larger in some people than others. But that's pretty much what's going on when people are eating, when it looks like they definitely have done something to meaningfully change the way their body expends energy in the resting state. I would speculate that that's really what we're observing.
Yeah, and you can notice, I think you mentioned in a previous podcast somewhere, that if somebody met you when you were like fully fed at a higher body fat percentage, and then again 6 months later at the end of a contest prep, it's like a completely different demeanor that you have as a person.
Absolutely, yeah. Fat Eric is a lot better to be around than lean Eric, that's for sure.
Are you fat Eric or lean Eric right now?
I'm very fat Eric right now.
So you must be really, really nice.
No, I must be really, really mean when I'm leaner. Yeah, this is about as pleasant as I get. So it's all downhill from here.
So is there any final or is there any thoughts of competing again in the future, or is it mainly focusing on coaching for now and the research still that you're doing?
I think I'll definitely compete again. So one of the things that's been really frustrating, so my most recent prep was when I turned pro and then made my pro debut, but I kind of did it on a whim. I didn't plan to do it. I just started losing weight because I felt kind of crappy, and then the weight loss was going so well. I was like, well, I'm basically halfway done with a prep, so I might as well just prep. But then I had to finish my PhD, and then I had to get the ball rolling with all the stuff I'm doing with Stronger by Science and Mass. And so eventually I'd like to do it, but between all the academic stuff, the professional stuff, and a really annoying hip injury that I've been training around, it's been hard to set aside a good stretch of training to really put on some good lean mass. I was actually kind of in a bad mood today because I tried to hide it for the podcast. I had been training really effectively for a few weeks in a row, and then I just was being really stupid, and I got very greedy on the squat, and so now my back is like wrecked. But it'll be fine in like a few days. But it's just so annoying when you finally you're finally like through an injury, and then you just cause another one from being stupid. You're like, God, why would I do that?
Yeah.
But no, the plan is probably for the next year or two to try to really put on some good size, and then do a show. Actually, Eric, his Facebook is like Eric Lee Salazar. So he just actually became an IFBB pro. But he challenged me a few months ago. He said that we have to compete against each other in a few years, and I kept trying to like talk the timeline backward, and he was like, let's do it next year. I was like, absolutely not. But now that he's an IFBB pro, he's probably not allowed to compete against me. He'll probably lose his IFBB status, so I think I got out of that.
Is he an IFBB pro bodybuilder or men's physique?
Bodybuilding.
Well,
yeah.
Then would he not smoke, Like, no offense, but if he's an IFBB pro bodybuilder, he's probably
first of all, it's extremely offensive, and I resent the implication. I think I'd hold my own against Flex Lewis and Rolly, Dexter Jackson. I'm coming for you.
Yeah, it's Photoshop. It's all Photoshop.
No, so Eric competes. He competes in the under 150 pounds.
Oh, okay. So he's probably tiny, like really short.
He's basically my size. So he's we're about the same height, about the same weight. So basically, like the ideal human physique, basically, is how I would describe it.
I'm surprised, honestly, that somebody.
I'm kidding, by the way.
I'm surprised that somebody that size could become an IFB pro bodybuilder unless they were like 4'11". Like, just in terms of the mass that you need these days to be an IFB pro, but props to him.
No, I mean, so his arms are stupid. If you look him up on Facebook, his arms don't make sense. I don't understand how a muscle belly would be shaped that way, but I'm happy for him. But no, I think what happens is when you get down into the weight classes that are very restrictive, it's just like it's kind of like how I think the powerlifting records between males and females, Greg knows this better than I do, but when you start getting down into the weight classes that are like below 140 pounds, they start to become kind of similar, just because like there's not like a ton of, especially in like untested federations, there aren't like a ton of males on steroids who weigh like 120, 130 pounds, Gotcha. So I think it's because the weight class limit is fairly restrictive that you can actually be natural and still attain that pro status. But yeah, so I mean, Eric, if you look at his physique, it's insane.
Yeah, I'm looking at it now. Yeah, he's got insane He's got insane insertions on his arms, and
his arms are wild. He's an awesome dude. I really like Eric. Super nice guy. I'm super happy for him, and I'm very happy that now that he's an IFBB pro, he'll probably have to lose his pro card to compete against me, which means I probably don't have to lose to him, which is cool.
Well, anyway, man, thanks so much for coming on the show again. Where can people find out more about you? I know that you recently joined Eric and Greg, so Eric Helms and Greg Knuckles at MASS. There's a monthly applications in sport. Is it sports science or sport? What does MASS stand for again?
It's monthly applications in strength sport.
Strength sports, that's it. Yeah, that's a great resource. I've been a member of that for quite a while. You also work as a coach for Stronger by Science.
Yeah. So MASS, it's me, Greg, Helms, and Mike Zordos, who's a professor at Florida Atlantic. Really, really smart guy. So yeah, you can find some of my work with MASS, which is a monthly subscription
Research review, yeah. You can find me at Stronger by Science, which is me and Greg run the show over there with the help of Greg's wife, Lindsay, who is much better than us at anything that we do. And if you want to get in touch with me on social media, Instagram's probably the best place to do that. And my handle is at Trexler Fitness. Perfect. Well, again, thanks, Eric, so much for coming on. And I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
So that was a really useful conversation for me. I found that very, very insightful. It's an area of nutrition that I'm really interested in. I think probably because I'm in a contest prep at the moment and have been for quite a while, that it's just something that I'm drawn towards. But again, it's something to kind of note that we can't just put our body weight into a calculator online and expect to see those exact results every single week. And it comes back to the fact that our body tries to stay in homeostasis, that it tries not to get too heavy or it tries not to get too lean. And if we do actually want to push the boundaries either way, we're going to have to, sometimes dig a little bit, whether that's adding more food when we struggle to eat more, or whether that means that we're going to have to drop calories more than we actually think we will and suffer a little bit more. But if you found this episode useful, please do, again, leave a review or rating or any comments or feedback that you have on iTunes or Apple Podcasts. And again, reach out to me on Instagram or at my email. And if you want to find out more about Eric and look into some of his work, I've left the links as well in all the descriptions of the show notes, whether you're watching on YouTube or you're listening on some form of podcast player. But again, I appreciate you listening this long if you have made it till the end. And I hope you stay tuned for future episodes, because I have many more interesting guests on that are lined up to talk to me. Thanks a lot, guys, for listening, and I will chat to you in the next episode.